Imagine this. Columbus, Ohio, April 1st, 2006, 1:55 a.m. A tall medical student named Brian Shaffer is standing outside a packed bar, the Ugly Tuna Saloona. He's laughing, relaxed, talking to two women. Security cameras capture everything. He turns, he walks back inside, and in the next few minutes, he disappears. No exit footage, no witnesses, no body, no trace. His friends wait outside as the bar empties. He never comes down the escalator. His girlfriend waits for their trip to Miami. He never shows. His phone goes straight to voicemail and never rings again. Just weeks earlier, Brian had buried his mother. He was trying to move forward, planning a future, planning to propose. Then, in a place filled with people, cameras, noise, and light, he vanishes without a single explanation. Police reviewed every camera in the building, every exit, every angle. They found him going in, but never coming out. 20 years later, that footage still haunts investigators, because this wasn't a dark alley. This wasn't the middle of nowhere. This was a crowded bar in the middle of the city. So the question is, how does a 6'2" man disappear inside a building with every exit covered? And what really happened in those final minutes after Brian Shaffer walked back inside? 20 years later, that grainy footage still haunts investigators, because the most unsettling possibility isn't that Brian left, it's that he never truly left at all, and whatever happened in those final minutes has never been explained. Columbus, Ohio, late March 2006. Brian Shaffer was 27 years old, a second-year medical student at Ohio State. 6'2", broad-shouldered, easy smile, the kind of presence people remembered. He balanced long hours in the lab with late nights playing guitar, talking music, quoting Pearl Jam lyrics with friends. On his right arm, a Pearl Jam tattoo, a quiet reminder that he wasn't just building a life in medicine. He was still holding on to something more personal. On the surface, everything looked exactly where it should be. But just 3 weeks earlier, something had shifted. His mother, Renee Shaffer, had died after a battle with a rare and aggressive blood disorder. Brian had been there through all of it. The hospital visits, the slow decline, the final goodbye. Friends would later say he seemed okay. Still laughing, still making plans. But grief doesn't always show itself in obvious ways. Sometimes it hides just beneath the surface. In the days before that Friday, Brian said something that would later stand out. He told his girlfriend Alexis that maybe she deserved someone better, that he felt like a mess. At the time, it didn't sound like a warning, just something people say when they're tired, when they're overwhelmed, when they're trying to hold everything together. Friday, March 31st, the last day of classes before spring break. That evening, Brian had dinner with his father, Randy. Just the two of them. A quiet meal. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable. Just a father and son adjusting to a life that suddenly felt smaller. Later that night, Brian met up with his friend and former roommate, Clint Florence. They headed into the University District, a stretch of bars, music, and noise where students went to forget everything for a few hours. At some point, Meredith Reed joined them. Plans were simple: drinks, music, a night out. Nothing more. It was supposed to be ordinary. A few hours to relax, to reset, to feel normal again. And at that point, that's exactly what it was. But somewhere between that moment and the end of the night, something changed. Something that would leave no clear answer, no explanation, and no way to piece together exactly what happened. Up until that point, everything had been normal. Just another Friday night. Brian had already been out for hours with his friend Clint Florence. Later, Meredith Reed joined them. They moved through the University District, bar to bar, drink to drink, music, noise, laughter, nothing out of place, nothing memorable. Around 1:15 a.m., security cameras captured the three of them riding the escalator up to the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a crowded second-floor bar inside the Gateway complex. Inside, it was packed, the kind of place where people brushed past each other without noticing, where minutes slipped by without anyone keeping track. At some point, Brian got separated from his friends. It didn't seem unusual. Witnesses would later say he looked fine, relaxed, just another guy enjoying the start of spring break. Then, at 1:55 a.m., the camera outside the entrance recorded him again. Brian stood near the top of the escalator, casually talking with two young women he had just met. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Nothing intense, nothing strange, just small talk. He smiled, said goodbye. Then he turned and walked back into the bar. That was the last confirmed image of him. Inside, the night continued, music playing, people drinking, crowds shifting, and somewhere in that movement, Brian disappeared. Clint and Meredith eventually realized they had lost track of him. When the bar began closing shortly after 2 a.m., they made their way down to the bottom of the escalator. They waited. People came down in waves, friends, strangers, couples. Everyone who had gone up eventually came back down. Everyone, except Brian. At first it didn't feel alarming. It was late. People split up all the time. Maybe he had already left. Maybe he had found another way out. Maybe he was already on his way home. They called his phone. It went straight to voicemail. They checked inside briefly. Nothing. So they left. The next day passed in silence. Then another. By Sunday, the calls from his girlfriend Alexis and his father Randy were no longer casual. They were urgent, repeated, unanswered. By Monday morning, April 3rd, something was clearly wrong. Brian was supposed to meet Alexis at the airport for their trip to Miami. He never showed up. That's when it stopped being a missed call and became a missing person. When police reviewed the security footage, one detail stood out immediately. They had footage of Brian going into the bar. They had footage of nearly everyone leaving, but they had no footage of Brian coming out. The escalator was the main public exit. The camera covering it was working. It captured everyone else. Brian was the exception. Investigators expanded their search. They checked surrounding cameras, nearby streets, other businesses in the district. Nothing. No confirmed sighting of Brian after 1:55 a.m. There were possible blind spots, a service door, construction areas within the building, places where a camera might not fully cover, but none of those possibilities showed him leaving. Not on video. Not in any confirmed witness statement. No one reported a fight. No one heard a scream. There was no blood, no disturbance, nothing that suggested anything had gone wrong, and yet something had. A 6'2" medical student walked back into a crowded bar and then vanished. That's what makes this case so unsettling. Not what we see, but what we don't. Because somewhere between that moment, when Brian turned and walked back inside, and the moment the bar emptied, something happened. Something quiet. Something fast. Something that left no clear trace behind. The footage ends at 1:55 a.m., but the questions were only just beginning. By Monday morning, this wasn't confusion anymore. This was a disappearance. April 3rd, 2006. Brian was supposed to meet his girlfriend Alexis at the airport. He never showed. Calls went unanswered. His apartment was empty. By that afternoon, the concern turned into panic, and by evening, Columbus police were inside the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Detectives retraced the night step by step. They secured the security footage. They followed Brian's last confirmed movements. He walked back into the bar at 1:55 a.m. After that, nothing. No clear exit, no confirmed path out. At that point, every possibility remained open. Accident, foul play, voluntary disappearance. Police began with the people closest to him, friends, witnesses, anyone who had seen Brian that night. Their accounts aligned, no arguments, no signs of distress, nothing that suggested anything had gone wrong. So they turned to the building itself. The entire gateway complex was searched. Every level, every access point, service areas, construction zones, hidden corridors. K-9 units were brought in. They worked the scene, tracked possible routes, found nothing. No blood, no personal items, no signs of a struggle. Detectives expanded outward. They pulled surveillance from nearby streets, bars, businesses across the district. Still nothing. No confirmed sighting of Brian after 1:55 a.m. Phone records added another layer. His phone showed brief activity in the days after he vanished. Signals placed it within the university district, and then it went silent. Leads were followed aggressively. The two women he spoke with that night were identified and interviewed. Their statements matched the footage. That lead went nowhere. Over the following weeks, more than 100 people were questioned. Employees, witnesses, anyone connected to the bar that night. Investigators even brought in architects. They studied the layout, mapped blind spots, looked for any route that might not have been covered by cameras. They found possibilities, but no proof. And that's where the investigation began to shift. As weeks turned into months, and months into years, the case grew colder, but it was never closed. Brian's father, Randy, searched relentlessly, following leads, checking tips, refusing to stop, until his death in 2008. And tips continued to come in, from across the country. Some believed Brian had walked away, started a new life. Others pointed toward something darker. Police followed every lead, but none of them led to a definitive answer. Even now, decades later, new information still surfaces. New names, new theories, new possibilities. But nothing has ever explained what happened inside that bar. The footage remains the same. Brian smiling, turning, walking back inside, and then nothing. Everything was checked, every path examined, every possibility considered. And still, no one can explain how he disappeared. The investigation remains open. The answers are still out there. But after all this time, one truth has become impossible to ignore. Something happened in those missing minutes, and whatever it was, it left almost no trace behind. After everything investigators tried, every search, every camera, every lead, they were left with something harder than evidence. They were left with possibilities. Because Brian Shaffer's case doesn't give us a clear suspect. It doesn't give us a motive. It doesn't even give us a moment where something visibly went wrong. And that's exactly what makes it so psychologically unsettling. Most cases eventually point somewhere. A person, a pattern, a mistake. This one doesn't. So instead of answers, we're forced to look at people, at behavior, at what might have been happening beneath the surface, in Brian, and in anyone he may have encountered that night. At 27, Brian was carrying more than most people could see. On paper, his life looked stable, a medical student, a future doctor, a relationship, plans, direction. But 3 weeks earlier, his mother had died, not suddenly, not peacefully, but after a slow, exhausting battle with a rare blood disorder. He had been there for all of it, watching someone he loved decline day by day, holding it together while everything underneath was shifting. And that kind of grief doesn't always explode. It doesn't always break you in obvious ways. Sometimes it just changes the way you think, the way you feel, the way you see yourself. In the days before that Friday night, Brian said something small, something easy to ignore. He told Alexis that maybe she deserved someone better, that he felt like a mess, not dramatic, not alarming, just quiet. But statements like that matter, because they show a fracture, not a collapse, but a shift. Grief can do that. It can create distance from people, from plans, from the version of yourself you thought you were becoming. It doesn't mean he intended to disappear. It doesn't mean he wanted to leave. But it does mean he wasn't as steady as he appeared. And that matters. Because whatever happened next happened to someone already carrying emotional weight. But Brian wasn't alone that night. He was in a crowded bar, surrounded by people, movement, noise, strangers. And when a person disappears in that kind of environment, investigators have to consider another possibility, that someone else was involved, not necessarily someone obvious, not someone who stood out, because the most dangerous people rarely do. They blend in, they look normal, they talk calmly, they offer help, they don't trigger alarm. Psychology often describes certain behavioral patterns, a capacity for detachment, for control, for acting quickly, without emotion getting in the way, the ability to do something and then return to normal life, as if nothing ever happened. That kind of behavior doesn't require rage. It doesn't require chaos. Sometimes it only requires timing, opportunity, and the absence of attention. And that's exactly what that environment provided. A crowded space, limited visibility, blind spots. Moments where no one is really watching anyone else. If something happened inside or just outside that bar, it didn't escalate loudly. There was no scream, no fight, no visible disruption, which suggests something else entirely, something controlled, or something so quick. No one had time to react. Psychology doesn't stop at the moment something happens. It also looks at what comes after. Because people respond differently. Some distance themselves completely. They disappear from the narrative, avoid attention, avoid involvement. Others do the opposite. They stay close. They listen. They follow the investigation. They insert themselves into conversations, not always out of guilt, but out of control. A need to know what others know, to manage perception, to stay ahead of the story. And in a case like this, that possibility can't be ruled out. But the deepest psychological impact of this case isn't on a suspect, it's on the people left behind. Because Brian didn't just disappear. He disappeared without an ending. There was no body, no confirmation, no moment of closure. And that creates something psychologists call ambiguous loss, a state where someone is gone, but not fully gone, where hope and grief exist at the same time. His father kept searching until the day he died. His girlfriend kept calling, kept waiting. Friends kept replaying that night, trying to find the moment they missed, but there is no clear moment. And that's what makes this kind of loss so heavy. Because there's nowhere to place it, no final answer to hold on to, just questions. The footage doesn't show fear, it doesn't show danger, it shows something else. Normal, a man smiling, talking, turning, walking back into a room full of people, and disappearing. That's what stays with people, not the idea of violence, but the absence of it, because it forces a different kind of question, not just, what happened to Brian, but how easily can something happen without anyone noticing? Because sometimes, the most dangerous situations don't feel dangerous at all. They feel familiar, safe, routine. And by the time something changes, it's already too late. In the end, this case doesn't give us a villain. It doesn't give us a clear motive. It doesn't even give us a moment we can point to and say, that's where everything went wrong. Instead, it gives us something far more difficult, uncertainty. Because sometimes the most disturbing truth isn't knowing exactly what happened. It's realizing we may never be able to prove it, and that somewhere, between a normal conversation and an ordinary walk back into a crowded bar, something occurred that erased a person without leaving a trace. After everything we've seen, after every search, every camera, every unanswered lead, we're left with only a few ways this night could have ended. None of them are comfortable. 20 years later, the same grainy footage still plays on repeat. Brian walks back into the bar at 1:55 a.m. and is never seen again. No exit, no body, no explanation. So what actually happened in those missing minutes? Theory 1. He walked out unnoticed. It sounds almost too simple. A crowded bar. Music loud enough to drown out conversation. People moving in every direction. No one really watching anyone else. The Ugly Tuna wasn't a sealed space. There were service doors, construction areas, temporary exits tied to renovations in the building. And at closing time, everything becomes chaos. People rush out. Groups split. Strangers blend together. In that moment, it's possible Brian slipped through a secondary route. Not the main escalator, not the camera everyone focused on. Just one door, one blind spot, one decision. And suddenly he's outside, unseen, no crime, no struggle, just timing. Because sometimes, in a crowded place, disappearing doesn't require anything dramatic. It only requires not being noticed. Theory 2, a tragic accident. But if he did leave the main area, where did he go? Below the bar, parts of the building were still under construction. Unfinished spaces, exposed sections, areas not meant to be accessed, dark, unsecured, easy to enter by mistake, especially after a night of drinking. If Brian moved through a service door or temporary access point, he could have stepped into something dangerous, a fall, a misstep, a place where one wrong move is enough. And in an environment like that, no one would hear it, no one would see it. Searches were conducted, the building was examined, but construction changes things. Spaces shift, areas get sealed, structures get altered, and some believe If an accident did happen, the evidence may have been lost with the building itself, hidden, buried, never meant to be found. Theory 3. He chose to walk away. Then there's the most human explanation. Not what happened to Brian, but what Brian chose. He had just lost his mother. 3 weeks earlier, after a long, exhausting fight. Medical school was demanding, relentless, and in a quiet moment, he told Alexis something that stayed behind, that she deserved someone better, that he felt like a mess. Not a plan, not a goodbye, but a signal. Some believe that in those early hours, something shifted, that he walked out of that bar and decided not to come back, start over, disappear on his own terms, leave behind the pressure, the expectations, the grief. But this theory has its own problem. Brian had plans, a flight to Miami, a relationship, a future he was actively building, and after that night, there was nothing, no financial activity, no confirmed sightings, no trace of a new life. If he walked away, he did it perfectly. And that's what makes this theory hard to hold on to. Theory 4. Foul play. And then there's the possibility no one wants to sit with for too long, that something happened inside that bar, or just beyond it, not loudly, not violently, but quickly, quietly, because there was no scream, no fight, no disruption anyone remembers, which means if something did happen, it didn't look like danger. It may have looked like a conversation, a brief interaction, a moment that didn't stand out, someone who didn't seem threatening, someone who didn't draw attention. And in a place full of people, that's all it takes. One encounter, one decision, one moment where no one is paying attention, and then it's over. No witnesses step forward, no camera captures it, no evidence remains, just absence. And the unsettling possibility that whoever was involved walked out of that building like everyone else, unnoticed. Each of these explanations answers something. The blind spots explain the missing footage. The construction explains the lack of discovery. The grief explains a possible reason to leave. The environment explains how something could happen unnoticed. But none of them explain everything. And that's the part that keeps this case alive. Because no matter which theory you lean toward, there's always something that doesn't fit. Something missing, something unresolved. And that missing piece is exactly where this case refuses to rest. So now the question isn't just what happened. It's this. Which explanation feels closest to the truth, and which one doesn't sit right at all? Because for 20 years, every answer has left something behind, and until that final piece is found, this case doesn't end. There's one detail almost everyone misses the first time they watch the footage. Brian is standing outside the Ugly Tuna Saloona at 1:55 a.m., talking casually with two women. He smiles, he laughs, then he turns and walks back into the bar. That moment, 1:55 a.m., has been replayed for 20 years, frame by frame, second by second, not because it shows something unusual, but because it doesn't. Most people focus on what happens after, but the real question is right there, in front of us. Look again. He doesn't look scared. He doesn't look drunk or disoriented. He looks normal. And that's exactly what makes it so disturbing. Because if something did happen in the minutes that followed, it didn't come with a warning. No visible fear, no hesitation, no moment where the night suddenly felt wrong. Just one ordinary turn. Back into the noise. We like to believe we would notice, that something would feel off, that there would be a signal, a look, a tone, a shift we could recognize. But most of the time, there isn't. In places like that, crowded, loud, full of movement, people don't watch. They assume. They continue. And that's where something can happen. Quietly, quickly, without breaking the surface of the moment, because sometimes if danger exists, it doesn't look like danger. It looks like a conversation, a familiar face, a normal interaction that doesn't stand out. And then it's gone. That's what this case forces us to confront. Not just what happened to Brian Shaffer, but how easily a moment can slip past us without ever feeling different. You've been in moments like that, in crowded places, around strangers, in conversations that felt completely ordinary, moments you never questioned, and that's what makes this unsettling. Because Brian's last confirmed moment wasn't dramatic. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't even suspicious. It was ordinary. And that moment, 1:55 a.m., may be the last time everything made sense, because whatever happened next didn't leave a mark, didn't leave a sound, didn't leave a trace. And that's the part that stays with you. Not just that he disappeared, but that he disappeared from a moment that looked exactly like any other. And sometimes, the most haunting truth isn't knowing exactly what happened. It's realizing there may never be a moment we can point to and say, that's where everything went wrong. Because if it can happen like this, in plain sight, in a crowded room, in the middle of a normal night, then the question isn't just what happened to him. It's how many moments like that we've already lived through, without ever noticing, and how many more will pass us by the same way. For 20 years, that single moment has refused to let go. Brian Shaffer walked back into the bar expecting nothing more than another Friday night. Instead, he stepped into a mystery that still has no ending. His father, Randy, spent the rest of his life searching. His girlfriend, Alexis, kept waiting for answers that never came. His friends replayed that night again and again, trying to find the moment they missed. But there is no clear moment, no sound, no signal, no point where everything obviously went wrong. And somewhere out there, someone may still be carrying a piece of what happened in those missing minutes. If you have any information, no matter how small, please contact the Columbus Police Department, because sometimes all it takes is one detail to finally break years of silence. The next time you see it, someone turning back into a crowd, disappearing into noise, into movement, into ordinary space, it won't look unusual. It never does. And that's what makes this case so difficult to forget. Because Brian didn't disappear in darkness. He disappeared in plain sight, between one step and the next, between one moment and 1:55 a.m. If you found this story meaningful, you can follow for more cases like this. Until then, pay attention to the moments that seem ordinary, because sometimes nothing looks wrong until it already is.